Oh, because he goes to all the festivals.
We might get going again, I think.
Mostly, he puts on the cover of the Man.
This last segment,
The crowd shot. He
in
never puts the
honour of
performers.
Dorothy.
He says, well, it's about the crowd,
It's
isn't it?
the last formal segment that we will be doing. Once again, we have some songs and some poetry and some prose and some reminiscences that my brother Joe will be doing, and we'll be opening with the songs which Joe will introduce.
And anyone else can do reminiscences too.
Yeah, but we're going to have a break after Joe's one.
So you're aware, my mother had an incredibly long and varied career. She covered many different genres of music in her time during her plays. We're only going to cover the songs that came from the same period as Merv's, mostly because they're the only ones we can sing. So, as long as you remember, there are far more songs written by Dorothy Hewett than the ones we will cover here, and most of those in the theatre and their theatrical style songs.
Today you're going to get the Ballad of Norman Brown to start, which is out of that book. It's a poem Mum wrote, or a ballad, whichever way you want to look at it. It was probably set to music by a fellow called John Meredith. Nobody knows quite when. Sometime probably in the early 60s. She supposedly wrote the poem in 57, we think. It's about still I think today, the only known death, murder, whichever way you want to look at it, in a strike in Australia. Although I did get told by a musicologist who I immediately didn't like, that it was proven later that Norman Brown was a scab, and that's why he was killed. I don't know. Mum obviously didn't think that, and she's written a paean to Norman Brown. There's a tune out, the tune that John Meredith set it to, and it's been recorded 4 or 5 times by various folk luminaries. Warren Fahey from Folkways, the Fagans, some of them know the Fagans, 2 of the Fagan children, wizard children, music players now live up in Katoomba sort of area. And they're a legendary family in the folk movement, and old friends of Joe's here and Adele's. The Roeths, who run a band called Collector, have very recently recorded it. They rang me up, and I told them over the phone, I said, that's not the original tune. Mum had an original tune. And I had to sing it to them over the phone. But they said, geez, we love that, but we've already arranged the other one. So all the music's already recorded, we just want to sing it over the top, so they didn't do it. They did Collier Laddie. I did this about a year or 2 ago at a thing down at Belvoir Street Theatre, when that new production of Man from Muckin' went on, which was a cracker of a production. I loved it. Aboriginal production, largely. Yeah, so I'll see if I can do it again. I did it on a chromatic then, I'm going to try and do it on a diatonic now, which doesn't mean anything to most of you, eh? It's the little ones. See how we go. Pub style, a cappella. There was a man called Norman Brown. The murdering bosses shot him down. They shot him down in Rothbury Town. A working man called Norman Brown. An honest man, the parson said, and dropped the clods upon his head. But honest man or not, he's dead. And that's the end of Norman Brown. Cold bosses wipe their hands and sigh. It is a pity that he died. It will inflame the countryside, and all because of Norman Brown. At pit-top meetings and on strike in every little mining town, when miners march for bread and rice, their marches honest Norman Brown. Though they drop big stones on him, and though they bury him deep down, he mutely calls from earth and mine, you cannot silence Norman Brown. A miner's pick is in his hand, His song is shouted through the land, a land that's free and broad and brown, the land that bred us Norman Brown. Norman Brown, ah, Norman Brown, the murdering bosses shot you down. They shut you down in Rough Town. To live forever, Norman Brown.
Oh, cock of the morning, with a dream in his hand, my love has come home to a wonderful land. He burst through the door with his eyes like the sun, and his kit bag crammed full of the treasures he's won. There's pearl shell from Broome, and a tall Darwin tale, and coral and clam, and the jaws of a whale, and my kitchen is full of the smell of the sea, and the leaping green fishes my love brings to me. Oh, tumble your treasures from Darwin to Broome, and fill with your glory this straight little room, with the sun in the morning ablaze on his chest. My love has come home from the north of nowhere. And deep in our beds we'll love and we'll lie, we'll kiss and we'll listen to the rain in the sky. Warm as the summer we'll hide winter long. My love has come home like King Solomon's song.
I'm going to get the chords on. I'll fake it.
Just had to change the key.
I don't know how to play in this key.
The peace doves are cooing for Katie, my dear, with the sun in the morning and the spring of the year. The peace doves are cooing, okay. Do you hear? Do you hear? And when you are grown and summer is high, will you listen, my darling, to the birds in the sky, flying so wild in the green mango tree? Oh, I ask nothing better for Katie and me, that a love that is strong
Mum had a famous ballad called Clancy and Dooley and Don McLeod. Won a few awards for her very early in her writing life. And this is not a dental prosthetic, by the way. This is a space age pipe stand. Best one ever invented. About 9 months ago. Hang on. It's cold up here. Gotta warm up the reeds in this one. Sorry. Looks weird, doesn't it? That's right. But someone's out there look like a rabbit trap. That was you, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. Joe's going to play guitar on this, but he says he doesn't know the chords now, so... and he's retuned my guitar to play Weevils in the Flower later, so you'll get that. If you know that, you can sing along on that
That was
one.
supposed to be a surprise.
It's supposed to be a surprise.
It's on the programme.
So I'm going to play his
Who
now.
reads the program?
I'm going to have to sit down because I can't handle standing up with straps and all that sort of thing usually. Chris Kempster set this to music in about 2002, shortly before he died and shortly before Mum died. He had a really nice version, a really pretty, sweet version. But it ain't a really pretty, sweet poem. It's a tough as nuts, freedom's cry for freedom. And I always thought, I like Chris too, he's a great bloke. Oh, there's something to read on this, sorry, forgot. So I always kind of wanted to do something else with it. So I did, fairly recently. Tried to spring it on Joe to get him to do it. Recorded it very badly recently. That's the wrong book. There it is. Hope I don't knock this table down next time. Okay, there's another book that's out for sale there. It's like really out for sale with the bookshop. It's very new. Selected Prose of Dorothy Hewett. Most people know she
How
wrote a
much
few.
is it?
Don't
We don't
know.
know. We can't find any
Oh,
prices.
can't you? It's got a scanner on the back. I don't know. You can
We
scan it.
can't scan it here, I don't think.
Yeah, they've got a scanner there. But I don't know. It's only come out like in the last 6 months, and I wasn't at the opening. I don't think. Or maybe I was. No, I wasn't. By Fiona Morrison. It's got some great old stuff in it and some fairly more recent stuff. But she did write a little bit about the writing of this ballad in a little bit. It's been collected from Max Brown's book, The Black Eureka. This poem, by the way, is about the first black strike in Australia, which a lot of people think was the Wave Hill mob, but it wasn't. Obviously, the eastern states are going to think that. But it was actually up in Port Hedland. And it was back in 46. Anyway, I'll let Mum tell you. I'll just read a tiny bit of this. She wrote a foreword for that book in the 70s. And it's a bloody good book, too. This is a bloody good book, too, of course. Go and buy this one. It's in there. Okay, I'll just read a few little bits. It introduces the song, sort of. It also introduces someone we knew in the mountains up until about a decade ago when I was living here. I came to Port... It's pretty hard to read it with this thing on, but still. I read it through to harmonica with the board like that. Where's the thing? I came to Port Hedland in the summer of 1946 because I shared a common desire with Max Brown and Donald Stewart, the West Australian novelist, to write the story of the first Aboriginal strike in Australian history. On May 1, 1946, when the war was just over, Aboriginal station hands in the Pilbara withdrew their labour at shearing time and struck for 30 shillings a week, better conditions and the right to elect their own representative. I didn't write my own story of the Pilbara strike. I wrote a single ballad, Clancy and Dooley and Don McLeod. See, I'm jumping through this. Graham Alcorn, editor of the Communist Workers' Star, and also recently Best Ladies Man Poet in the Blue Mountains, rest his soul. True, eh? And I, that's been Dorothy, shared a pokey office above Perth London Court and wrote up the headline strike news brought by special courier to outwit the police when every other West Australian newspaper had blacked out the stories. The strike eventually collapsed, wrote Hamish MacDonald well. In bare bones, I suppose that is what happened. A little mob of Norwest Aborigines without status, funds or human rights. It always moves me, this thing. Challenging the feudal strongholds of squatters, missions, courts, newspaper barons and governments, all the way up to the United Nations. It's a classic story of the underdog and his uncountable resources. It records the birth of the militant Aboriginal movement and it's part of Australian history now. So that's a little bit of what Mum made. But you can read a lot more about the story of that strike in here. And a lot of other things that have to do with Dorothy Hewett in the old days, to do with politics, to do with writing and all sorts of things. Good book. There's also a selected poems in there that's all come out at the same time from UWA Press. Okay, so I reset it anyway. And I was cheeky enough to write a new first verse, sort of explaining it a bit. I'll see if I can do it. I prefer someone to play the guitar on this, but still. And Joe's retuned my guitar, so I can play his, which will be weird. I don't know if I can do the pick thing at the start. Maybe I won't even bother. Sorry, I can't sing it there. Where's your capo? Yeah, that's it. Okay, let's skip the first bit, just get straight into it. This is fun rock. Well, I gotta get the tape. When I was about 3 feet 6, my mama told me a tale. It was back in 1946. Soldiers coming back on the land, back drove the struck for 30 bob a week. Nothing more right to organize. That's right. That's right. That's right. Well, Clancy and Dooley and Tom McCloud walked by the wells when the wind was loud and the voice was new. As the fresh shot running and they keep on fighting and they keep on running. Tom McCloud beat out a bow, and a lot of queer things came out in a rush like Uncle Dog with a flattened tail. They sneaked him up to the headline jail. Black strike, black strike, black strike, black strike. They said it loud and smiled in the eyes of Don McCloud. Working men all over the land heard what they shouted and shook their hand. Black strike, black strike, black strike. Sheep's wool dragged and the squatters swore. Talk fine words till their tongues got sore. And the belly swelled with so many lies, but the black fellas brushed them up like flies. The sheep got lost on the squatters' run. Sharing season was nearly done. The squatters eating up with greed said, hey, good pickers and did good feed. Black strike, black strike, black strike. Well, the black fellas sheared the wool and then they took their wages like working men. The squatters' words were stiff and sore. Won't pay wages like that no more. Black strike, black strike, black strike. Well, the white boss said stay out of town and the ground with the boots to keep them down. Starve them out until they crawl. Back on their bellies we'll starve them all. The sun was blood on the bare sheep runs and the women whispered they'll come with guns. The blacks marched to their camp and were proud and they sat down there and laughed out loud. Black strike, black strike, black strike. Young men marched down the road like thunder, picked up the dust and pelted it under. They marched into town like a whirlwind cloud, said, open up the jail and let out Don McCloud. Squatters rode around in the night time, load up your guns and keep out quiet. Let's teach these niggas they can't rob. Big white bosses on 30 bob. Black strike, black strike, black strike. Well, young men are hunters, old men make songs, and the words of the people are carved with wrongs. The tribes of our country they sing and are proud. The pilgrim man and the white white man McCloud. Voices lightning all over the land, and they catch up their fists in the sweat of their hands. Voice of the workers is thunder and laugh. Right with Clancy and Dooley and Don McCloud. Backstrike. When the wind is loud, the voices blue as the fresh sap running, and they keep on fighting, and they keep on coming. Don McCloud beat out a mold. Now a lot of clear things came out in a rush like mongrel dogs with their flattened tails. Sneaked him up to the headland jail. But Clancy and Dooley, Don McCloud, walk by the worldies when the wind is loud. When the voices blue as the fresh sap running, and they keep on fighting, and they keep on coming. Keep on fighting, and they keep on coming.
Once I rode with Clancy. Once I rode with Clancy through the wet hills of Wickapin, by Cunjin and Corrigan, with moonlight on the roofs, and the iron shone faint and ghostly on the lonely moonlit siding, and the salt earth rang like crystal underneath our flying hooves. Oh, once I rode with Clancy when my white flesh was tender, and my hair a golden cloud along the wind, among the hills of Wickapin, the dry salt plains of Corrigan, where all my Quaker forebears strove and sinned. Their black hats went bobbing through the Cunjin churchyard with great rapacious noses, sombre-eyed, ring-barked gums and planted pine trees, built a raw church in a clearing, made it consecrated ground because they died. From this seed I spring, the dour and sardonic Quaker men, the women with hooked noses baking bread, breeding, hymning, sowing, fencing off the stony earth that salts their bones for Thanksgiving when they're dead. It's a country full of old men with thumbscrews on their hunger, their crosses leaning sideways in the scrub. My cousins spit to windward, great noses blue with moonlight, their shoulders propping up the Cunjin pub. Oh, once I rode with Clancy through the wet hills of Wickapin, by Cunjin and Corrigan with moonlight on the roofs, and the iron shone faint and ghostly on the lonely moonlit siding, and the salt earth rang like crystal underneath our flying hooves. And the old men rose muttering and cursed us from the graveyard when they saw our wild white hooves go flashing by. For I ride with landless Clancy, and their prayers are at my back. They can shout out strings of curses on the sky. By Wickapin, by Corrigan, by Cunjin's flinty hills, on wild white hooves that kindle into flame. The river is my mirror, the wattle tree our roof, adrift across our bed like golden rain. Let the old men clack and mutter, let their dead eyes run with rain. I hear the crack of doom across the scrub, for though I ride with Clancy, there is much of me remains in that moonlit dust outside the Cunjin pub. My golden hair has faded, my tender flesh is dark, my voice has learned a wet and windy sigh, and I lean above the creek bed, catch my breath upon a ghost with a great rapacious nose and sombre eye. This is the last poem of Mum's I'll be doing, a little lighter in its way. Living dangerously. Oh, to live dangerously again, meeting clandestinely in Moore Park, the underground funds tucked up between our bras, the baby's pram stuffed with illegal lit. We hung head down for slogans on the bridge. The flatbed in the shed ran ink at midnight. Parked in the driveway, elaborately smoking, the telltale cars, the cameras, shorthand writers. Plans for taking over. 3 years the revolution. The counter revs out gunning for the cadres. Escape along the sea shelf, wading through warm waters soft with blood. Wow, what a story. Guerrilla fighters wear cardigans and watch it on the box. Lapsed party cards and labours in again. Retired Comrade X fishes Nambucca heads. And Mrs. Petrov, shorthand typist, hiding from reporters, brings home the weekly bacon. But oh, to live so dangerously again. Their stamina trousers pulling at their crutch. And I'd like to introduce now Rosie Scott, who will be reading from Mum's book, Halfway Up the Mountain. Rosie was a great friend of my mother's when my mother lived up here.
Actually, I met Dorothy and Merv in Varuna. I was doing a reading and Dorothy and Merv turned up to hear it, and Dorothy's first words were to me something like, "I bet you won't come and visit us." And I said, "Yes, I'd love to come and visit," because I was very honoured and all that, so of course and after that we had a very close friendship for many years. And I've chosen from this book here because it's my favourite. It's a book I read regularly, about every year, I think. I think these are amazing poems. And I'll start with Inheritance. I've travelled a long way from my origins. Is there anything left of the child with the wheaten hair who listened for owls, loved poetry and winter fires, remembered the strange moment in the dark fields when the pet lambs grown into ewes and wethers trotted along the fence lines, bleating to be let in? You could never go back, only onwards into the world, leaving behind all the loved things. The grandfather flying on his winged nag through the frosty paddocks, the handsome father hallowed in sparks, roasting spuds in the ashes of the playroom fire. Where do you go from there, concealed in darkness, glowing in the heat and the grass, the hawk in the wood, the plovers spinning of spring in front of the plough, to the old woman watching for her bulbs to come up, the irises lining the path, the white cockatoos in a flurry of wings, a visitation of angels. Beautiful. Halfway up the mountain. The cat wakes up in the tapestry chair, washing her face with her wet paws each morning. My husband makes up the fire. Husband and wife, what strange words they are. The camellia pushes against the warm glass. It has been looking into this room for 150 years. Last summer, we bought a hearse from a funeral director. Now we drive it, sleek, black, shining like death or America, up and down the mountains. People stare as we pass and ask to look under the bonnet. What do they expect to find there? That's a very Dorothy line. My son says it'll come in handy. I imagine it stuffed with flowers, moving slowly, taking us both to the cemetery. My son is driving, his profile set in an elaborate mask of unconcern. I have only one friend in the cemetery. I would like to be buried near him, under that straggle of 6 stringy barks. Sometimes I think, what am I doing here, miles from the ocean or any landscape I recognised? The idea was to make a new start, but there are only so many new starts in a lifetime. In the end, running out of words like exile or relocation, you discover you can live without anybody. But after all, these are still my people, pensioners, single mothers, dropouts, weirdos and superannuated hippies. The last of the folkies, hunched in his St. Vinny's overcoat, plays bush ballads on a squeeze box in the village, as the black hearse passes, drawn slowly up the mountain, dropping away in a cavalcade of loss. Neighbours. I remember this visiting. I'm sure everybody does remember those neighbours. Neighbours, you old curmudgeon, hawking and spitting on the other side of the fence. You have sent your bees into our garden to sting my husband's eye. Mowing, cutting, complaining, while in our feckless garden the hard little plums drop onto the grass, the peaches rot with fruit fly, and the capeweed makes nectar for your bees. In the lottery of life you continue to pick out the bummers. The old woman and her dipso daughter stowing her hard liquor under the blackberry bushes. The queer man who danced in the garden, drunken, naked, and warm as toast at midnight. And now these profligate poets stretching their legs in the sun, building their ramshackle edifices, leaving the jobs half done. You tamp them down with concrete, but the roots of their towering trees heave up through the earth. Their leaves blow like the tempests of life over your windows. So what else to do but send in the bees, golden with lust, stinging with retribution, buzzing like God in our ears. This is one of the only overtly political poems here, I think, in this collection, and it's after my own heart because it's about asylum seekers, and I think it's a beautiful one, very simple. In such a time, it's called Exodus. In such a time as this, when multitudes stream out abandoned, bombed from ruined cities, grandmothers hobbling, babies, bicycles, luggage on carts and backs, the crying children, there are no boundaries, a private grief shrinks to a pinprick on this frontier. The ditches filled with blood and suitcases, lovers shot through the heart, abandoned toys dragging the severed limbs, a three-legged dog limps off across the plain. This unmourned multitude who trudge across Earth's thunderous surface, Belgrade to Kosovo to Baghdad burning. And the last one I love because it's a very subtle one, which I kind of really feel I understand. It's the way I feel too, but it's with Dorothy's poems, you read the obvious ones first, and then you start to pick up other ones that have a whole new subtle kind of meaning and world. This is called In Wind and Rain. I have a natural affinity with wind and rain. For me, it stands for something other, surcease from pain. The scent of the frangipani is nostalgic enough to begin. The azaleas flowering lift their heads for the breathing in. Pressing close to the window glass, the plum tree, hazy with bloom, reaches in to measure it out, the circumference of my room. The turbulent spring outside equates with something within. The earth is beginning to stir just as the mind begins to shuffle up out of the dark. The seed from that darkness springs, shaking his rain-wet feathers. The magpie begins to sing. These are the gifts unasked, but waited for season on season, not so much to change a life, but to give it a greater reason. A covenant all is not lost, another year to survive, a kind of promise to keep that the elements are on my side. Thank you.
Last summer, my sister Desi, Merv, Lilley and I went back to the bend in Two Creeks, dropping down through the Darling Ranges into the Avon Valley and out across the plains of the Great Southern. We arrived in Yeelering late on Saturday afternoon, but the town was deserted. Only the shadows of Arthur Kelly's river gun stretching across the road from the station, as if he had planted his own epitaph. Where had they all gone? And what had happened to Saturday, when everyone came to town, when the main street was alive with cars and trucks and sulkies, and we collected our puck and Tiger Tom from our co-op pigeonhole. Now the only place open was Paul Kingston's cool drinks and ice cream shop, where we bought our weekly acid drops, and the stranger behind the counter had never heard of anybody we ever knew. I can shut my eyes against the glare and smell my way up this street. Paul Kingston's, Kingston and Salter's General Store, the Co-op, the bank and the post office, Mr. Honeyman, the saddler's, the pub, the butcher's shop, and on the rise opposite Lou Fuller's, Mr. Coxon, the blacksmith, in a grease-stained leather apron, black hair sprouting out of his nostrils. These shades, more real to me than the people I met last week or last year, perhaps I will bring them out once again, carrying their wooden chairs from the shop fronts, to sit under Arthur Kelly's trees, waiting for the Albany doctor to ruffle the surface of the salt lake, waiting for the hush before the lights come up. We drove across the railway line to the boundary of Lambton Downs. On the other side of the iron gates was a hose running hopelessly into a sheep trough with a hole in it. Nobody came this way now. The roads were grown over, the gates wired up. Desolate, treeless except for the hardy York gums and jams. The crossing over the creek was barely distinguishable, but lying in the hollow were a scatter of corrugated iron sheds and a single brick chimney. Oh God, we cried. Oh God, is that the house? The loose roofing iron flapped up and down over the broken boards on the veranda. Rabbits started up under our feet. A well-fed feral cat glared and ran. Swallows had nested in our sitting room cornices. Only the 4 main rooms with glassless windows and the old dunny had survived. I used to sit there for hours, hiding from the drying up, reading Pipsqueak and Wilfred in the Illustrated London News, scratching my first boyfriend's name, Max Green, on the weatherboard walls. But my mother made me take the scrubbing brush and scrub it all off again. When I write him my first love letter, secretly posting it without a stamp, she storms into the Yeelering post office to retrieve it. Dear Max, it says, what kind of sums do you do now? Love from Dorothy. Sitting by the cold black stove in the kitchen, looking out towards the creek bed, listening for the inevitable crow, I heard the scrape of my dead father's spade in the orchard. Desi and I sank down on the broken veranda and wept silently together. There was no one left but us to remember them now. No one but us to mourn for our tender, fragile country. Tuesday's child is full of grace, chants my mother on her good days. Great gawk, she screams on her bad days. Probably both are true. A great gawk full of grace, a Tuesday's child, I stagger forth to make my history. You've said enough, snaps the ghost of my grandmother, so hold your tongue.
This is kind of a strange thing to do at this point in the proceedings, but I asked to do it. And the reason why is that the last time I was here in Varuna was almost exactly 10 years ago. It's all going to be upsetting to me, folks. And I had to give the eulogy at my mother's funeral. And how do you cover such a huge life in just a 2-page eulogy? I decided to cover only 3 years of her life. And that was an interesting time, I describe it. It was only a very small part of such a large life. And since then I've been, when you reach my age, you start going to funerals. And I've been to a number of other funerals. And I've noticed that people don't do it the way we did our funeral. They're able to get up and describe what their relationship was with the deceased, those people that love them best, and knew them best. And when your mother's famous, you can't exactly do that because you've got to preserve a public image in a way. You don't have to, but it's there and you know it's there and everyone knows it's there. And there's no doubt that my mum was a public figure. She had won every prize in literature there was just about in the country. She received an Order of Australia. She's got a star down on Circular Quay in the footpath, and the ultimate accolade for any poet. In a subdivision in Canberra, there's a street named after her. So, and she loved to get on. She was always being interviewed, and she loved to get up, and they would always ask her the same things about being a communist, about having all these lovers, blah blah blah. And we're all a bit dubious about this, by and large, sometimes, because the fact is that Mum did everything 100% when she did it, and for the first period of her life, while she was in the Communist Party, she totally wrote political material almost during that whole Communist Party period. But when she stopped, she almost totally stopped writing political material. You have to struggle to find a single piece of political material she wrote in the last 30 years. And secondly, there's the question of all the lovers, which is... I can remember there was a communist who wrote a book about how she'd had 60 lovers. And Mum got quite upset about this. And she's sitting there and she's counting on her fingers. And she gets up to, I've only got 22, she said.
It's your head for figures that you remember.
And she was quite upset. Anyway, there wasn't much she could do about it, being about 70 by this stage. However, she did make the most of those 22, though as far as I'm concerned, 21 of them were probably a waste of time. And the man she lived with till the end of the days was the one that was there for her till the very end. And so, see, I'm losing this. I should have written it all down. Okay, what I'm planning to do is this. I want to describe the last conversation I ever had with my mother a few days before she died. And like all last conversations with people, when you know it's going to be your last conversation, you don't have to talk very much if you've known each other for 50 years. You just say a few things, and you've got 50 years of history behind you. So it's hard for anyone else to understand. And that's why I've never told this story to anybody. Maybe Adele, I can't recall. And I'm not going to tell you what it was all about. If you know, you know. If you don't, you don't. I'll just tell you a few things. First thing is, my parents were arch eccentrics. I mean, they were eccentrics in many different ways. Just for a start, let's pick one. We've got Daniel in the audience. Daniel said, we went up to Sydney one time and Dan said, Dad, why is Merv always sharpening knives when we get here? Now I know better than to try to make sense out of anything that happened in my family. And having lived in Africa for a while, I was able to give a very African answer. I think I said to him, perhaps they are blunt. And Mum, well, there was a tyranny of the bath. I don't think anyone's ever talked about this. The bloody hot baths. She had to have them every night of her life, and they were red hot. Nobody else could get into them. And nobody knew why Mum had to have such hot baths, but she had to have them. It had been a fact of life since we were tiny. And these very hot baths had to be prepared. Her mother said it was to wash away all her sins, but anyway. Later on, when I got varicose veins, I started to realise that a hot bath could actually be pretty helpful in that regard. But anyway, so these hot baths had to be made. And one of Merv's big jobs was to make sure we made the hot baths. So we used to have these ancient hot water systems that fell to bits, and Merv decided, being a bushie, that we'd have to have this giant chip heater he brought in. So he brought in this bloody great thing, and we'd come home from somewhere, and this fire had to be lit in the bottom to warm the whole thing up. And I could see, I was old enough to realise there was potentially a lot of trouble from this job. So I went for a fairly dangerous but ultimately successful strategy. I showed complete incompetence at lighting fires, and I still do, as someone pointed out to me the other day. Unfortunately, my younger brother Michael, who isn't here, had shown an early aptitude in this respect because he tried to light 2 fires under the house at the age of 3. I was able to pass this task on to him, so he got into trouble if the fires weren't lit on time and it was all produced. And the trouble is that I went up to Sydney when Mum was ill, getting towards the end. And I looked around and said, what's going on around here? There seems to be a lot of construction. And I said, what's that over there? Oh, Mum said, oh look, I couldn't get to the regular bathroom around there, it's hard for me to move around now, so Merv has built me another bathroom there. And I said, well, what's that over there? Oh, he's built another bathroom over there. And I walked out and I walked in the dark room, and he built another bathroom in the dark room. He had a bath in there. Who has a bath in their dark room? And once again, it's hard to make sense out of this, but I think he just felt there was one thing he could do, was make sure Mum had her bath, and when he couldn't really help her in other ways. And so Mum says something about, oh, I don't know whether I can get to that bathroom. And Merv disappears and he rushes out, and I can hear this phone call going on. I said, what's he doing? I think he's going to build another bathroom. Unfortunately, Rosie was there, and we joined forces, and we said, Mum, you've got to stop him building bathrooms. He's going to turn the entire house into bathrooms.
Pulled up the floor.
Yeah, he pulled up the floor already in the half hour we were talking. Oh. And so I thought, for a terrible moment, I thought Mum was going to yell out, Merv, Jay says you can't build any more bathrooms. In which case my life wouldn't have been worth tuppence. But fortunately he says, Merv, you have to stop building bathrooms. And so we had to stop at that point. And later, after she was gone, Rosie happened to foolishly mention that the roof didn't look too good. And Merv is about, I don't know, how big would he be? 300 pounds, something like that.
125 kilos at present.
Yeah, okay. And Merv decided he had to climb up into the roof and fix it. He's 85 years old. He climbs up a ladder. He gets into the roof. And something happens up there. He gets his foot trapped, or something falls on him. I'm not quite sure of the exact details. And he's stuck there, and there's no one in the place. So he thinks, maybe I'm going to die in here. I'm trapped in this roof space. And so he thinks the bed might be under him. So he decides to bounce up and down in this roof space so that the whole ceiling will come crashing down with him in it. Unfortunately, he missed the bed. But anyway, this was not so funny because he took some injury. He took a broken arm, and he took some broken eardrums, which has affected his hearing. And these come into what I'm going to talk about. What I'm going to do is, first I'm going to read a poem that I wrote. And this is part of a larger poem. The poem was actually about 3 carers for people who died of cancer. And it's also about 3 men of 3 different generations waiting for their wild women to come home. I'm not going to explain it any more than I've done. You can wait for my memoir as to what it's all about. It's called End of the Town, and it refers to this little boy in disobedience from A.A. Milne who took good care of his mother, though he was only 3. Mother, he said, you must never go down to the end of the town without consulting me. Okay, poem, End of the Town. Paper covers rocks, scissors cut. She slips her prize money to the drunken poet, her lover. Find us a place for us, she cries. The wife finds him drunk on the proceeds, takes the 1,000, that's only fair. The husband just sharpens, grinds knives and axes, slices a pathway to eternity. And now she is old and ill, the drunken poet is departed. The husband, the old man, tends her infirmity. He strains, lifts her, breaks his hernia. He builds bathrooms 1 to 5. What else can he do? She is gone, the old man lies trapped in his roof space. He bounces once, twice, falls amidst the ruins of his house. Punctured eardrum, broken arm. Only he knew how to place the pillows. 11 pillows just so for the worst patient in the world. I will go north, he says. See you in the slack. Which is something Merv very often said. And to follow this up, I want to talk about Mum's attitude to death. And what I did was, what you can do now is you can actually search through poets' collected works and find out references to single words such as death. I ran into another poet the other day, and she said she commonly searches through her stuff and to make sure she's not using the same word too much in her poems. But anyway, I went through, and I was quite surprised to find that her attitude to death had been virtually unchanged since she was 16 or 17 years old. I'll just read a couple of things from it. Something from the Chapel Perilous, which actually was a quote from her when she was a girl. It was annihilation. I could never accept annihilation. The shadow of it lay over everything I did. My whole life has been a struggle to be identified with someone, something, anything that gave me even a brief sense of my own immortality. And yet I've always known, even when I struggled hardest, that annihilation was the end of it. Even when, no, especially when, I was wild with joy because I thought I'd found, even for a moment, that immortal otherness at last. Much later, something called Christ and the Cock. Who has seen Christ walking at dawn, pale-faced blood marked from the tomb, his black beard smattered with red, his eyelids shuttered with death? Why do you rise up to embrace me with your scarlet horror of death and your blood-heavy imagination? from Alice in Wormland, and this refers to the same drunken poet in my poem, but except in this one he's called Nim, the golden boy from the end of the garden, which shows our different perspectives on this particular gentleman. Anyway, yes. Alice knows what death is. Nuns dead, they told her. The nuns dead, they told her. Lying in a ditch at the bottom of a garden. Thief, cried Nim on the winter wind. Hang on. Alice lives in the age of darkness, beyond Eden's rim, remembering him, that Nim whose changing face laid waste her garden. I was your muse, your absurd Juliet. Giddy with death she spins. Why has it died this city in a mind? Done, Alice said, all over. A hand small, ice-cold, horny, closed over hers. Alice, the voice whispered, thou owest nature a death. And finally, elegy for Philip. This refers to the friend of hers who was buried in the cemetery halfway down the mountain. On that day when I celebrated my 70th birthday, you were hemorrhaging in the shower. I didn't know till 2 days later at your funeral in the small graveyard, halfway up the mountain. I think of you often when we passed the cemetery. I believed in nothing, only the bleak-faced fact of death, the space where once you walked. Die, I sobbed, die, and that indomitable voice whispered, I'm still here. Someone who can write. And the thing is with Mum, that her whole life she was very terrified of death. It was probably the biggest fear in her whole life, and it was to her annihilation, that a space would be left, she would no longer be there, she had nothing to draw on. And that made her, in the last couple of years of her life, very difficult to deal with. That's why she was called the worst patient in the world in this. As my other sister said, Dorothy seems to have, Mum seems to have, where other people have got pain and discomfort neurons, Mum's got 10 for everyone else has got. And she was constantly in discomfort, she was constantly in pain. She was exactly the sort of patient nurses hate. And she put a lot of pressure on those members of the family that were present here in Sydney. And I came up, it's easy for me to come charging out of nowhere. And I came up and I had a fair idea about what doctors say. And I went in to see her, and she was looking very, very small. She was looking tiny in this bed. And she had a tiny little voice, and she wasn't really the big mum that we knew that was always the centre of any room. And I said to her, what did they say, Mum? So she told me. There was only one way to deal with Mum. You had to hit her in the guts. I mean, it was the only way. Other people, you give them the truth, they cry, they run away, they won't believe it. Mum took it. She was her own worst critic, and she could deal with the truth very, very well, which most people can't. And so I said to her, Mum, what that just said was, it's gotten into your lymph system, it's all over you, and it's all over in a matter of weeks. That's what it said. That's what it says. Oh, she said. Oh, because she hadn't understood. I hadn't explained it to her. And a funny thing happened at that point. She just kind of expanded. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. She just grew from this tiny little person into this huge figure. That's the way it seemed to me looking at it. And then she started saying a few things to me. She said, Joe, the best thing you ever did was when you broke up me and Drunken Poet / Nim. I said, Mum, I shouldn't have done that. None of my business. I was old and wise by this time. She said, Joe, I loved you because we went through so much together. I said, yeah, we sure did. She said, I'm sorry I made you the father of the house for so long when there was nobody else. I said, Mum, I actually liked it. Let it go. And finally she said, the worst thing that ever happened to me was when Clancy, my little boy, died of leukemia. And I said, yeah, I know, Mum, but I didn't yet know that was yet to come. And I like to think she went out of there. Other people saw her after that. And that she said to death the thing that always frightened her most. And she marched in a bit, and I suspect she probably had the morphine stepped up, and 3 days later she was gone. And that's what I'd like to tell you tonight. This is a completely different treatment of the song, and I want to sing it in a different way. Usually it's told about a situation in the Depression, it's expressed that way. I want to sing it in a different light tonight, which is basically that leading a hard life makes you tough. I hope I can play it after all that.
On an island in the river.
Island in the river, there's a river, one stress of charity in the best way that you can. On an island in a river, where I grew to be a man. For though bread is bitter, bitter bread and sour, there's grief in the taste of it, there's weevils in the flour, there's weevils in the flour. Just across the river, mighty PHP, through pollution on the waters, and smoke was black as Hades, rolling hungry to the sea. For no bread is bitter bread and sour. There's grief in the taste of it, there's weevils in the flour, there's weevils in the flour. There's humpies by the river, where we lived on golden stew, and just across the water, those Christmas fest grew, and the hunger of the many filled the bellies of the few. For though bread is bitter bread and sour, there's grief in the taste of it, there's weevils in the flour, there's weevils in the flour. Bitter bread and sour, as grief in the taste of it, as weevils in the flour, as weevils in the flour. For no bread is bitter bread